Welcome to Looe, one of the loveliest towns along the south coast of Cornwall. And over the course of this walk around Looe on a gorgeous sunny afternoon, we'll explore all that the town has to offer, as we navigate a network of enchanting medieval lanes and bask in the wide open scenery of Looe's pristine white sand beach, best viewed from the end of the unusually named Banjo Pier. We'll also take a deep dive into this town's impressively varied history, from its origins as a busy harbour and fishing settlement to swashbuckling tales of smuggling and piracy, and to its rise as one of Cornwall's most popular tourist destinations of all, which it still remains today. All of that is to come over the next 25 minutes or so, as we take in the many sights and sounds of Looe. But we begin our walk with a surprising fact, that the town we know today was actually once upon a time two entirely separate settlements. Here we're gazing out over the waters of the East Looe River, historically the boundary between the separate towns of East Looe, across the river from us, and West Looe, where we're standing now. Today East and West Looe do very much coexist as part of one larger town, but they still retain slightly different identities. For instance, the western side of the river here is generally a little quieter, a largely residential area with a collection of winding lanes and independent shops, along with intriguing local landmarks like this, St Nicholas's Church. Originally built in the 13th or 14th century, this historic place of worship was once upon a time the main church in West Looe, although through the centuries it's also been used as West Looe's Guildhall and even the town's prison, with local convicts held inside until as recently as 1852. The church regained its role as a religious venue that year, and it remains one to this day, standing at the foot of a road which winds up a hill towards Hannafore Point on the coast, where steep rocks and cliffs tower over a small pebble beach, which offers some wonderful views of this town's coastal scenery. Sadly, we won't quite have time to venture out towards West Looe's seafront today, because we're going to begin making our way inland along Quay Road here, before we then make our way across the river and into the bustling streets of East Looe. But as we get going, let's take a quick look at a map to see exactly where in Cornwall you'll find the town of Looe. Nestled on Cornwall's always gorgeous south coast, Looe lies not far from the border with Devon, just 20 miles from the city of Plymouth in fact, a place which once upon a time provided the bulk of visitors to Looe in its infancy as a tourist destination. As is plainly evident from this beautiful view of the river, Looe is a quintessentially picturesque Cornish town, and so it was one of many in this county which emerged as a popular seaside tourist spot in the late 19th century, and even today it still ranks as one of Cornwall's most beloved holiday destinations in the 21st century. But we're really getting ahead of ourselves, because long before Looe became the popular tourist town that we know today, it was of course made up of two entirely separate towns, which faced off against one another on opposite sides of the river here. Separated by the river, East and West Looe grew up independently through history, emerging around the time of the 13th century, and they were linked only by a small wooden bridge, which stood roughly where the modern river crossing is today. Each home to a modest population of their own, the two were fundamentally separated as they were part of different parishes, areas of the country which centred around a parish church. West Looe here was part of the parish of Talland, which extended westwards towards the village of Polperro, while East Looe was part of a parish known as St Martin by Looe, extending eastwards. Why did this matter? Well, as part of different parishes, East and West Looe actually ended up being run by different local governments. In fact, by the 16th century, the two towns were electing their own MPs to the Houses of Parliament, only reinforcing their nominal divide. However, what once divided East and West Looe is what ultimately helped to bring them together. because the river, which formed the boundary between the two towns, emerged as the site of one of the liveliest ports along Cornwall's south coast. Protected on both sides by high cliffs as it flows out towards the historically busy trading routes of the English Channel, the rather wide East Looe River here was a perfect natural haven on the craggy Cornish coast. Even today, there are plenty of small boats moored in the middle of the river. But once upon a time, the port here greeted ships of all sizes engaging in international trade. Traditionally, the port of Looe was best known for its healthy fishing exports, particularly of pilchards, as well as a strong local shipbuilding industry. But over time, as Looe grew into one of Cornwall's largest ports of all, it started to export goods from all over the region, with textiles, Cornish tin, and plenty more making their way out of Britain through this very port. This commerce dominated life in both East and West Looe for centuries, the heyday of the port lasting from the medieval era until the turn of the 19th century. But the story of this thriving waterborne trade wasn't without its ups and downs. As one of Cornwall's, and by extension southwestern England's most important ports, Looe was often eyed up as a target by enemy forces. These were typically raiding parties from across the Channel in France, but in later years they also included pirates. Looe's most infamous encounter with pirates came some 400 years ago in 1625, when the town here was attacked by Barbary pirates from North Africa, who stormed into the streets, mostly of East Looe across the river, and looted all that they could, in the process burning much of the town to the ground and even abducting around 80 local people, who they took back to be used as slaves. Fortunately, as we can see, the people of Looe were able to rebuild. Although, even today, you will actually find a few historic buildings which survived that devastating pirate attack. Some in West Looe here, which was less affected by the raid, but even some across the river on the streets of East Looe, which we'll explore in a few moments' time. But of course, to get over to East Looe, we have to cross the river. And the only way to do that here, unless you're a very good swimmer, is by way of the bridge, which by many measures is Looe's most important landmark of all. Known simply as Looe Bridge, the river crossing that we see today was built around 170 years ago in the mid-1850s. But the truth is that this is actually the third bridge to have been constructed across the river at this point. The very first link between East and West Looe was originally built around 600 years ago, at the beginning of the 15th century. But it was little more than a creaky wooden bridge not suited to the amount of traffic that would pass over, as Looe continued to grow as a thriving port. So, a couple of decades later, in 1436, a much stronger stone bridge was built in its place, crossing the river a few yards further downstream, roughly where the boats closest to us are moored today. Now fortunately, this new stone bridge was much more durable. In fact, it carried people across the river here for more than 400 years. Although by the 19th century it had eventually fallen into disrepair, and so it was replaced by the one that we're walking across right now. If the current Looe Bridge is anywhere near as durable as its predecessor, then it should still be standing in the 23rd century, and perhaps beyond, by which time the town of Looe will certainly have many more stories to tell. But, as we now reach the other side of the bridge, we find ourselves for the first time in East Looe, historically the larger and livelier of the two towns, where the majority of trade and commerce was conducted over the centuries. The first point of interest we encounter here is the town's war memorial, unveiled back in 1921, and which pays tribute to the locals who lost their lives fighting in the First and Second World Wars. Notably, the town of Looe was directly involved in the Second World War. In the early 1940s, a number of defensive positions were built along the town's seafront, while some streets here were even blocked off with anti-tank defences, should an amphibious invasion by the Nazis land on the south coast of Cornwall. Fortunately, such an invasion never came, But close to the mouth of the East Looe River, there actually lies a small island, known as Looe Island, which during the Second World War was actually bombed by the Luftwaffe. The reason? Well, Looe Island is also known as St. George's Island, and it's likely that the German bombers mistook it for a Royal Navy ship called HMS St. George. Of course, this blunder was roundly mocked in the local papers shortly after, although the town of Looe did actually suffer some damage, with a number of windows broken from the blasts. Otherwise though, Looe largely escaped the worst effects of the Second World War, and today we can see buildings from long before lining the town's streets. For instance, many of these shops on Fore Street date from the mid-19th century. By the mid-19th century, Looe's heyday as one of Cornwall's busiest ports had largely come to an end, the Napoleonic Wars having taken a toll on fishing and trade in the English Channel. But it was soon replaced by a nascent trend of tourism, as people from the nearby city of Plymouth, and even as far away as London, came to Looe to enjoy the fresh sea air and the town's picturesque historic streets and lanes. The late 19th century saw new houses, hotels, shops and more all built to cater to the growing number of tourists coming to Looe. And a good 150 years later, this remains the town's main industry, with a lively atmosphere on local streets every day, particularly during the busy summer season. The rise of tourism has certainly reshaped this historic town. As the population grew on the back of the tourist trade in the late 19th century, Looe grew to need large new facilities like the Grand Guildhall here, which was built in 1877 as the headquarters for the local council. Standing tall with its mighty clock tower over the streets of East Looe, the Guildhall is one of the town's most distinctive landmarks, and a symbol of how things have changed here through time. Once upon a time, East Looe's council met inside a tiny stone building known as the Old Guildhall, the oldest standing building in town, which we'll be visiting in a few minutes' time. But as we stand before this symbol of modern Looe, we must ask a question that I'm certain has been on your mind. Where does this town's name come from? Well, first things first, it has nothing to do with the lavatory. Spelt L-O-O-E, the name Looe actually derives from the local Cornish language, in which it's known as loch. Very simply, loch, related to the word found in Scotland, refers to a deep water inlet, that being the East Looe River, which with its bustling port and harbour was the central feature of life here for centuries. As we know, East Looe here was the central hub of commerce back in that time, and the street that we're walking along now, Fore Street, was the main street in East Looe, always busy with activity. Today, Fore Street is lined by an array of popular shops and other captivating buildings. Just up ahead on the left, for instance, there stands the Golden Guinea, one of the many historic pubs to be found on Looe's streets. Housed in a building of 1632, the Golden Guinea likely began life as a local merchant's house, but it later became a pub, whose name is said to derive from a remarkable treasure that was found on the premises. A huge collection of gold was found inside the building at some time in the 18th century. It may have been a bounty collected by Cornish pirates, or even the personal fortune of a wealthy resident of the house. But in either case, the hoard was worth many thousands of guineas, and so the pub which eventually took up residence inside the building came to be known as the Golden Guinea. As the medieval town's main street, there were once a dense collection of pubs along the length of Fore Street, giving sailors and traders a place to eat, drink, do business, or be merry just a stone's throw from the harbour. Indeed, just here we find another pub, the Ship Inn, one of the larger and evidently younger taverns on the main road, complete with rooms on the upper floors for those staying overnight right in the heart of town. Of course, if you don't fancy popping into the Ship Inn for a drink, you don't have to walk far for another option. Directly across Fore Street, in fact, there stands the Old Salutation Inn, a smaller and older pub of the 17th century, making it about as old as the Golden Guinea. But we've only just begun to see what the oldest streets of East Looe have to offer, because the Old Salutation Inn marks the end of Fore Street, and the beginning of a particularly narrow network of streets on which we'll find some of the town's oldest buildings, where people lived and worked centuries ago. Here, the road name changes to Buller Street, which leads down towards the historic Buller Quay that we'll be visiting later. But as we pass by the last of the modern shops here, if we turn just to the left, we're immediately met with a historic landmark, in the form of a building simply known as the Old House, or the Old Cottage. Having likely belonged to a local merchant, this house is believed to be nearly 600 years old, built around the year 1450, and is typical of many cottages of the era that you would have found lining the streets of Looe. Of course, most were destroyed in the Great Pirate Raid of 1625, making the Old House a particularly valuable local landmark, which stands just across the narrow Middle Market Street here from the Smugglers Cott, another historic pub which, as the name suggests, was once upon a time a popular haunt among smugglers, who were doing big business along the Cornish coast around 3 centuries ago. Indeed, these narrow streets busy with taverns were perfect for smugglers, and legend has it that a network of secret underground tunnels were dug beneath our feet to move smuggled goods around. Illegal trade wasn't the only form of business on these historic lanes though. This street is known as Higher Market Street, and as the name suggests, it was here that you would have found part of Looe's local markets, where some of the goods landed on British shores at the port were sold. The market stalls were also busy with fish caught in the waters off Looe, fishermen having long walked these streets and frequented historic pubs like the aptly named Fisherman's Arms, believed to have been built around 500 years ago, although that's nothing compared to the building which stands directly across the street. This is the Old Guildhall, built all the way back in the year 1450, which served for much of its life as the original headquarters for East Looe's town council, the local magistrates' court, and the venue for the town jail. Having impressively survived all the raids on Looe through the centuries, the Old Guildhall now stands as the oldest building in town today, and fittingly, it's home to a museum, inside which you'll find the well-preserved medieval jail cells and old courtrooms, as well as a number of historic relics from the town's history. Now, as we mentioned earlier, both East and West Looe emerged around the port in the 13th century, but that doesn't mean that this area was entirely unpopulated beforehand. Earlier in history, it's believed that people lived on the hills overlooking the river mouth here, and they may have ventured down to fish in the plentiful waters of the English Channel. But at that time, there were likely no permanent buildings here close to the coast. That was until the 13th century, when markets were first held here, and a church was built beside the sea. That was St Mary's Church, originally opened all the way back in the year 1259, as a place of worship for a growing number of fishing families who were moving into this burgeoning port town. Today, nothing of that original church remains, as St Mary's Church, as it stands before us now, was mostly rebuilt in 1882, although there is one fetching medieval feature to be found around the back of the building. Given the way that East Looe was attacked by French raiders and Barbary pirates on numerous occasions through time, it's almost certain that the town's largest landmarks would have been targeted above all else. And so it's remarkable that, just around the corner here, the 15th century tower of St Mary's Church still remains standing. Similar in age to the Old Guildhall and the Old Cottage, the church tower here is composed of stonework that's visibly different from the rebuilt Victorian church. But for a long time, it was actually painted white, intended to serve as an easy-to-spot landmark for ships approaching the harbour from out at sea. The white paint actually remained on the church tower until as recently as the First World War, and as such it would have fit in nicely with the whitewashed houses of East Looe's back streets here, which huddle around narrow lanes that were laid out a good 500 years ago in the Tudor period, in between the town's main market streets. Today, it's on these back streets that you'll find a number of holiday homes, a common feature of Cornish tourist towns in the modern day, some of which bear some unusual characteristics. This maritime figurehead, for instance, adorns the corner of the majestic Osborne house, a roughly 350-year-old townhouse which, like so many others in this part of Looe, likely began life as the home of a local merchant. Very simply, merchants built their houses in this area because it was a short walk from the river mouth, where the bulk of their business took place. As we discussed earlier, a wide variety of goods and services were on offer here during the port's heyday. Not only were locally processed pilchards, tin excavated from the mines of Bodmin Moor, and textiles brought in from inland mill towns for sale, but you also had a healthy array of shipbuilding facilities, an industry which actually outlasted many others in this town. Traditional trade subsided by the 19th century, but shipbuilding remained a busy source of income in Looe alongside the growing tourist industry well into the 20th century. In fact, during the Second World War, Looe's shipbuilders were responsible for the construction of dozens of motor torpedo boats, minesweepers, and more. But as we take in a view across the river towards West Looe, where we started our walk, you won't find much shipbuilding activity taking place in this town anymore. In fact, the river, which was once a bustling place of trade, is now a rather tranquil place, and a delight to walk alongside on a sunny afternoon like this. This part of the Riverside is known as Buller Quay, an industrial area of Looe that was built in the 1850s, as a venue for warehouses that were used to store copper, which had been discovered under Bodmin Moor, further inland, and was mostly exported through this port to smelting works in South Wales, principally around Swansea. It was there that copper was smelted to be used mostly in the construction of railway lines, which were fast expanding across Britain at the time, and Looe here was a beneficiary as well, because in 1860 a railway line was built linking this coastal settlement to the town of Liskeard, about 7 miles to the north. Known as the Looe Valley Line, it's still in operation today, and it's probably the best way to access the town of Looe from further afield, not only for its convenience, but also because it's one of Britain's most scenic railway journeys, running alongside the East Looe River here for much of its course, through a gorgeous wooded valley. The railway comes to an end just a brief stroll north of Looe Bridge, but as we can see, the river continues on towards the sea. And here, close to its mouth, we can see how the cliffs of West Looe, at Hannafore Point, provide crucial protection against the winds and waves of the English Channel for those mooring their boats in this town. On a splendid day like today, though, the river is largely still and sparkling blue as it flows out to sea. And so, let's also make our own way towards the seafront, which we remarkably haven't yet seen in our more than 20 minutes of exploring this town. East Looe's seafront is home to a gorgeous sandy beach, which we'll take a look at in a moment or two. But between us and it, here we find the town's modern lifeboat station, an important feature of this coastal town. This being Britain, the weather in Looe isn't always as spectacular as it is today, and with poor weather often comes dangerous conditions out at sea, and on Cornwall's rocky south coast that makes for an especially perilous recipe. Historically, in poor weather, ships sailing in this area would head for the major haven at Plymouth Sound further along the coast, but many were often dragged towards the coast by the vicious waves, wrecking on the rocks of nearby headlands. So in 1866 it was decided that a lifeboat station would be built here in Looe, to bolster rescue efforts for those caught up in shipwrecks nearby. And just in front of us here, that original lifeboat station still remains standing, although it's no longer in use today. The modern lifeboat station just beside was actually opened in 2003, providing a base for faster, more up-to-date lifeboats that can speed out into the sea and reach someone in distress as quickly as possible. On a calm day like today though, Looe's lifeboats hopefully won't be needed, with the glistening waters of the English Channel instead dotted with small sailing craft, and closer to shore, swimmers enjoying the town's delightful sandy beach here. Now, East Looe Beach may not be the largest in Cornwall, but it's certainly one of the most pleasant, surrounded on all sides by gorgeous scenery, which also acts as a natural shelter, providing generally calm and warm waters to bathe in. Today, the beach is remarkably quiet for a summer's day, but given Looe's popularity with tourists, it can get very busy during peak season, as can the pavement of the quay here, where surfers, sailors and more mingle with tourists enjoying ice creams, sticks of rock and bags of chips, hopefully safe from the seagulls always circling up above. Simply put, Looe has all the features of a quintessential Cornish seaside town, blending spectacular natural scenery with quaint streets and a riveting local history. And as we've explored the town streets on this beautiful day, we've seen the rich variety of stories to be found on a day out in Looe. But we're not quite finished yet, because here we're walking out towards the mouth of the East Looe River along what's known as Banjo Pier. This unusual name simply comes from the fact that the pier, with a rounded head, looks like a banjo when viewed from above. It was built back in 1896, and its banjo shape was actually a deliberate choice, intended to serve as a shorter, more substantial breakwater that would not only protect ships inside the harbour from rough waves, but also as a method to prevent the river mouth from silting up, and preventing ships from accessing the harbour altogether. The design worked wonders, and the river here remains easily accessible to this day, while for tourists visiting Looe, a walk out towards the end of Banjo Pier offers some unrivalled views of the coastal scenery. To our left, we can see the craggy Cornish coast as it extends eastwards in the direction of Plymouth, while to our right, we can see the rocks of Hannafall Point in West Looe towering over the mouth of the East Looe River. And as we spin around, we can also take in a gorgeous view back towards the town that we've been exploring for the last 27 minutes, with East Looe Beach here dominated by a prominent hill, which for some reason is known locally as Mount Ararat, although it does admittedly pale in comparison to the huge snow-capped mountain of the same name in eastern Turkey. But sadly, as we enjoy this wonderful seaside vista, it's here at the end of Banjo Pier that our tour of Looe has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own visit to Looe sometime soon.